In case you did not already notice or did not read about me, I worked at Yahoo up until very recently. I was the head of production engineering, running a bunch of teams like Yahoo.com, finance, and sports. Prior to that, I was the head of SRE at Zynga. Prior to that, I worked at IMVU for a long time. IMVU, as you know, is one of the pioneers of CD and Eric Ries's, lean startup. So that's the brief intro. The reason I'm here is because there was an article I published on LinkedIn a few months ago, and it actually got a lot of good feedback. And I was like, maybe I should start talking about it more, just because of the fact that there's a bunch of souls out there who actually took time to click on it and give me some pretty amazing feedback, which is why I'm here. Roughly the agenda is going to look like, I'll do a brief intro for a few minutes, and then I'll talk about some of the patterns of DevOps, and then specifically about uptime, velocity, and the industry trends, and DevOps itself, and some of the antipatterns. Okay, I think on the intro part, I think it's important to sort of do a quick refresher on why DevOps is important. Empathy. I know the previous speaker already talked about it. It's not a buzzword, it's important. Mindfulness is very important. It's a topic I'll be touching upon a lot in this talk. It also makes you a well-rounded engineer, teaches you soft skills. I'll touch more upon this towards the very end, where I talk about creating the right kind of interdependence between dev and ops. Mindfulness, I think it's important. Very important, mainly because most of us are sort of trained to act a certain way, including myself. We so are focused on the day-to-day stuff that sometimes we forget what is important, what is the big picture. So that's mindlessness. So mindfulness is more about being present, asking the question why is something important? How does that fit into the big picture? Questioning assumptions and things like that. So I think that's going to be a repetitive thing I'll be talking about in this topic. Okay, are you really DevOps, right? I've done this for a long time, and ops for a long time, and I hear a lot of things. I'm actually surprised even when some pretty senior people, when I ask them what they mean by DevOps, I mean they're like, I get all kinds of responses. All these are not necessarily false, but I think what they don't give us is, they fail to draw a complete picture of what truly DevOps is about. When I hear about all this, I'm like, you've gone through this amazing transformation. You've spent, lots of years, doing things like CD. But who are you really doing this for? Where do your customers fit into all this? Most often than not, people fail to address that question. I think most importantly, the real question we should be asking is, where does your customers fit into all this? How are they benefiting from all the changes you're making to your tools and process and culture? Am I? Oh, I thought that.
Maybe pull your mic a little higher.
Sorry, I forgot to turn this on. Sorry. Were you guys able to hear? Am I sure? Okay. Is that better? Did you even hear me up until now?
Yeah, I think that might be.
Okay. Cool. Awesome. So with that intro, let's get into the patterns. First one. Customers really don't care about 5 nines availability. I think after doing this for a long time, what I've noticed is they really care about 5 nines customer service. If there's something like that, we'll talk more about that. But the reason I say that is, things like your iPhones and laptops, Wi-Fi, the devices you're actually using to access a service or a product are themselves not very, they're not 5 nines reliable. So there's no point in most cases of making your service 5 nines reliable, just because customers don't expect that. We almost sort of have learned to live with the fact that things don't work all the time. Okay, does this graph look familiar? I've run ops for users from a few million users to at Yahoo we had over 1 billion users, and each time there's an outage, and your graph looks like that for RPS, it almost inevitably comes back, just showing you that your customers still love your product. They're not going to abandon you for being down. The point I'm trying to make is understand what is the right level of uptime that you need for your product. And for you to be able to understand that question, I think it's important to understand the user behavior, the customer behavior, gather some data, and exactly see like what is it that they care about, right? So it's important to establish that. And once you've established that, a great approach to holding people accountable and holding each, if you're a dev team and an ops team, holding each other accountable is to establish budgets, right? So once you have an external target, you may also have an internal target. And once you can establish those contracts between the dev teams and the ops teams, it makes I'll actually give an example on this on the next slide. But the formula is simple, right? You're under the budget, ship. If you're over, then slow down. A good example was when I was at Zynga. I'll come to the crux of this, but we had too many alerts going on, about 200,000 alerts going to a 50-person SRE team. And when one day I had this brilliant idea where I said, let's sit down. We actually sat down with each of the game studios and established contracts, actually error budgets, and said, if you go over certain limit, I will deny you SRE coverage. Like no more SRE coverage. You can do your own thing. You can go hire your own. You can go hire your own SRE team, but I'm not going to give you support. So what that did was it created the right incentives. It also aligned the incentives so that the dev teams had the right incentives to keep the alert volume low. SRE team had also the right incentives to provide that a good level of support to the dev teams. So these things actually work in real life, but it's important to actually sit down and talk about them and establish those contracts. Okay. And before you obsess over uptime, I think the reality these days is you get a few nines out of the box. You don't have to work really hard, and every nine after that, as we know, is probably going to be expensive. So don't. Again, it's about establishing the right amount of uptime and understanding the customer behavior before you try to over-engineer your application for reliability. The other thing is uptime is everyone's responsibility. I've actually spoken with product folks who said when you go and ask them, and being an ops person, when you ask them what do they care about, they say the site has to be up all the time. And I'm like, what does that mean, up all the time? Can you give me a number? So ask them those questions. Like try to quantify that. Just don't take just because the product said the service has to be up all the time. It doesn't mean that just ask for a number. Okay. I talked a lot about uptime, but there are going to be scenarios where uptime is going to be critical, right? In fact, one of the comments I got on LinkedIn was somebody said it's TurboTax, it's April 14th, and obviously you would want your site to be up. The same thing with when we have like live events, NFL, National Signing Day, or Berkshire Hathaway's first ever. You have to. Those are pretty tactical stuff. So if you prepare for them, you can actually make sure that your site is up. So I'm not suggesting that you should go down during that point of time, but that stuff you should be able to figure out with enough planning. In fact, I actually during the 2017 season when ESPN was down, Yahoo was up. So we're pretty proud about that. There was like 200 people in a war room for the whole day. Anyway, so that's pattern one. I know I talked a lot about uptime. The second pattern is about velocity. My background is at InView, and we routinely shipped 50 times a day. This was back in 2007, 2008 timeframe. We talk, even at Yahoo, we used to talk a lot about, we've spent all these years, going through CD, no humans allowed, everything goes to production automatically. But I think what we fail to do a good job at is what happens after you ship, right? You spent all this time, you're shipping multiple times a day, but what are you learning in terms of your customers after you've shipped something? So in my experience, I think engineers tend to sort of overlook part of this, so I'll be talking about that here. So again, your job is not done if you just ship. You have to follow up. You have to own your, your commit. You have to own your push. You have to follow up and make sure that you're learning about your customers. Again, garbage in is our garbage out. I mean, these days, fast CD pipelines, elastic serving stacks. It's not hard to get them in. Again, if you send in garbage, garbage is going to come out. Again, as I mentioned, the problem is most of us, at least based on my experience, are not as focused on on what happens after we ship. I have a simple sort of a plan, so you can call it a plan, but you can call it strategy or tactics, whatever you want to call it. But this is if you try to do this as an engineer, every time you ship or before you ship, if you ask yourself, why am I doing this? Why am I doing what I'm doing? How does what I'm doing now fit into the big picture, right? How does this? What does success look like? Like, why am I doing it now and not later, right? If you can do this simple exercise, don't spend a lot of time. But each time you're doing something, it sort of teaches you to be mindful about not doing things just for the sake of doing things, right? And after you ship, again, ask this question, what have you learned? Show me the metrics. Has anything moved? You planned something, right? You had a success criteria. So has that success criteria been met after you ship something? If you have not, like, why was it not met? Or have I not instrumented my application properly? Ask those questions. And then, the most important question you should be asking is, what else can I be doing to make things better, faster, bigger, and that sort of becomes your micro strategy. And then you iterate on that, and then go back and make things better. In fact, when I was at InView, just to give an example, our revenue increased 10x over a period of 1 year just by making it easier for people to use our product. Everything stayed the same, but it was just like people were coming into the funnel. Millions of people, but then they were finding it extremely hard or challenging to use the product and actually understand what the product is and the value it provided. But making it easy, and this didn't happen overnight. It was a bunch of iterations, a bunch of experiments, and actually learning about the customer behavior. Okay, and then I actually like this example a lot. I've seen people, how many times, let me just ask you a question. How many of you just commit something to production, just walk away or just go to lunch or just go home, right? It's terrible, right? It's really bad doing that. If you let's say you're doing CD, deploying multiple times a day, if you as an engineer don't care about learning, how the customers are actually using something that you shipped, it doesn't matter if your commit goes to production today or tomorrow or a month later, right? So you should be very particular. You should be really concerned and curious about the stuff that you push to production. Okay, and then how are you engaging with the customers? There's several different ways, but I'm hoping you're using a combination of all these. And maybe more. Again, it's important to develop that true empathy. Just to give an example, there was a CEO of this company called Machine Zone. I was interviewing with them like a long time ago, and his name is Gabe. He gave me an example where he said, if you really wanted to develop true empathy towards your customers, actually live like a customer. If your target customer is making, I don't know, let's say $30,000 a year, he said, live like a person who's making $30,000 a year using your product for a couple of weeks. Actually live like that person and then see what happens. I thought that was a brilliant suggestion, right? Pretty hardcore. Okay, let's see. Pattern 3, I think people have sort of been talking about this, but if you look at how the industry is evolving and how some of the tools like Kubernetes and things like microservices and Envoy, STO, and all the observability and all the good stuff and the buzzwords out there. What is happening is sort of, I call it like the democratization of distributed systems. It's easy to scale systems. It's easy to get a few lines out of the box. But with all this complexity and all these abstractions, what's happening is inherently, like, running a complex system is becoming harder and harder. So I think where the industry is sort of moving towards is the operations people are focusing on the infrastructure, platforms, observability, and the engineering teams or the dev teams are focusing on how can I use those tools, how can I use those platforms to enable themselves to do their jobs better, to make amazing products for their customers. And I also think that just business logic is no longer a strategic differentiator these days. I think it's important, especially given the shift that the infrastructure space is undergoing, thanks to people like Google. I think I'm noticing this, and it's important to keep this in mind. If you are one of those teams where you are not providing the right value to your engineering teams, it's probably time to question that. Okay. Let's see, examples. Several different examples. I think probably one of my favorites is when we shipped at Yahoo in 2015, we shipped a product called Daily Fantasy. So the production engineering team, which is my team, was helped the engineering teams to ship the product, helping them with DNS and infrastructure and platforms and things like that, monitoring, but mostly hands-off after that. There's also a team at Yahoo called Screwdriver, which builds these amazing CD pipelines for the whole company, right? So that's a beautiful model in the sense that the ops teams are going from traditionally doing things like SRE and being embedded with the engineering teams and helping them with monitoring and capacity and postmortems to more like building tools and platforms like Screwdriver, like Kubernetes. Actually, Kubernetes is also a great example where right now about 200,000 RPS worth of apps or RPS are running on Kubernetes at Yahoo, including Yahoo Finance and Yahoo Sports. And there's the production engineering team actually helped do that, which was a dramatic shift from what they were doing earlier. So they were more, I would say, in terms of the industry, they're more similar to SRE, but now they're slowly becoming, the sort of the infrastructure team. Didn't happen overnight, but I see this happening more and more, even at larger companies. In fact, if you're at a smaller company, you probably wouldn't even hire like an ops person until you're Series C or Series D, right? It probably doesn't make sense to do that. Cool. And then as a profession, I think I talked about this. It's very much alive, but I think it's really up to us to define our destiny, which is what we did at Yahoo. When we built the Kubernetes platform, we said, this is our destiny. This is how we will be adding value to the company. Again, the Screwdriver team is another great example. Okay. Again, I talked about scaling, and don't, if you're worrying about scaling, it's not hard to do for most companies. Until you're maybe, I don't know, some large company, and it's easy to do it these days. So don't obsess over it. Just like uptime, you can get away with a lot of brute force, solutions up until a certain point. Okay. I talked about the right kind of interdependence between ops and dev during my one of the earlier slides, but even the example I like to give is, as a manager, one of my sort of strategy or tactic is to tailor, my strategy towards each individual person, because everyone have their own strengths, right? Similarly, when you come to when you have the right kind of interdependence between ops and dev, what's going to happen is it creates that interdependence. For example, if I'm a dev team, I'll go to the ops team. In this case, for example, at Yahoo, it is the Kubernetes team, right? It's no longer the ops team. It's the infrastructure team. I think that creates the right kind of interdependence. People are also, once people are have ownership of a product or a platform, they are more willing to be held accountable. And there's nothing better than that, because that automatically creates the right motivation. It also introduces a healthy degree of disruption, because people feel the ownership. Again, the Daily Fantasy at Yahoo was a great example. Okay, pattern number 4. I think DevOps is table stakes. Even if you take the example of CD, companies have been doing CD for a long time, like for over, I don't know, over a decade, 12 years or so. Imbu, Flickr, at least the publicly known companies, right? So the strategic differentiator, in my opinion, is going to be like how obsessed you are with your customers, right? I think that's going to be the strategic differentiator. You have to have DevOps. I know we're at DevOps conference. I'm saying DevOps is table stakes. That's not a bad thing. It's just try to get there. But I actually got this from HBR, where they were doing they did some extensive study about a company, and they talked about how responding to customers fast actually gives you a hell of an advantage. In fact, people were willing to pay like 4x more amount for airline tickets, where the number of complaints are very high, as we all know. But if you have time, go check it out. It talks about why customer service is so important. Again, your customers could be your internal customers, external customers, but it's important to engage with them, listen to them. And trust me, when you don't listen to your customers, I've actually seen the consequences of that, and it's not fun to be in that spot. Them talking about DDoS attacks and security breaches, and people target you, and it's a nightmare. Almost there. Anti-patterns. I mean, there's not much actually. There's what I mean by that is really it comes down to when I said anti-patterns or anti-patterns. Anything that distances a customer from their user, or a software engineer from the customer, is an anti-pattern, right? So any layers of bureaucracy, any teams that you insert in between. I gave some examples, but if you hear things like that, where we say, oh, I don't want to be responding to alerts, and so let me add like 3 layers in between so that my devs don't get woken up at 3 a.m. It's like bullshit, right? So that's that, right? To actually give you an example, this is how things look like at Yahoo prior to me joining the company, and I said that doesn't make sense at all. That's like, why are there so many layers? And it just, people suffered. I mean, there were times where, if you are using Yahoo Finance, I mean, there were times where there was a P1 outage that went unnoticed for 14 hours. And then out of that, TTD was 13 hours and 50 minutes, mainly because the alerts have been sitting with teams who are sitting in, I don't know, some other state. It's not fun at all. It was a really hard thing to do, getting this change implemented. It's more political, as you can imagine, than technical, but we got it done. But yeah, if you see things like this, where there's unnecessary layers in between, question that shit, right? And then the results will look like that. There's a dramatic drop in TDE just because the devs were getting paged now directly, and then they were being woken up, which means they started writing better software and things like that. So that's it. Thank you and good luck.